Hello YouTube. As most of you know, Tamriel has a long and extensive history, with many countries, empires and rulers rising and falling over the millennia. Some are very well known, such as the Riemann Emperors and the Septim Emperors, but today we're talking about a dynasty of emperors which has been mostly forgotten by the 3rd and 4th era, the so-called Longhouse Emperors, a short-lived dynasty from the 2nd era. Now, their story is an interesting one, so let's roll the intro and let's talk about them. It was the year 533 of the Second Era, a little over 100 years after the fall of the Second Cyrodiilic Empire, which had been started by the Dragonborn Riemann Emperors. Now, in this year, a new Imperial dynasty, a very short-lived one, was founded in Cyrodiil when the Reachman warriors under the Reachman chieftain Durcorach the Black Drake overran the province of Cyrodiil and conquered the Imperial city, putting their chieftain, Durcorach the Black Drake, on the throne of the Imperial city, proclaiming him emperor of a new great empire, which consisted of Cyrodiil and the Reach. Now, this new emperor, Emperor Durcorach, would be the first of the Imperial dynasty which has come to be known as the Longhouse Emperors, a line of 3 emperors which ruled for around 50 years and consisted of the first emperor, Durcorach, his son, Emperor Moricar, and his son, Emperor Leovic. This dynasty was the first period of stability that Cyrodiil experienced since the start of the chaotic interregnum after the fall of the Second Empire, and it's honestly one of my favorite pieces of lore, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. To start at the beginning of the dynasty, we know relatively little of the first emperor of the dynasty's history before he became emperor. During his reign, he authorized a biography of sorts, but that biography is almost as reliable as approved biographies of North Korean leaders, as Emperor Durcorach's official biography states that a comet blazed across the sky on the night of his birth. Flocks of silver swans flew over his mother's house, and everybody who saw the little baby was awestruck by his strong beauty and his warrior's gaze. And that he killed large predator animals with spears when he was just like a 3-year-old toddler, so yeah, that biography is not too reliable. In truth, we simply don't know much about his childhood, and the only slightly non-glorified sources that we have basically start in his early 20s, when he was just a minor chieftain of a small clan of Reachmen among far bigger clans. But Durcorach was clever, and over time he managed to enlarge his clan and make alliances in the Reach, which led him to slowly becoming one of the major figures in the Reach. And for all terms and purposes, he would have stayed that way, just a powerful chieftain in his own right, but quickly forgotten in the volatile and tribal environment of the Reach, in which oral storytelling is the main part of storytelling, so not a lot of history is written down. But Durcorach wanted more, and allied himself with powerful witchmen and made pacts with Daedric princes to gain more and more power until he was able to subjugate all of the Reach. Now, it's important to note here that from all the sources that we have, we can relatively surely say that Durcorach was never a very devoted Daedra worshipper, as it's said that he made many pacts with Daedric princes during this period, but he was more of an opportunist. He never was a real worshipper, rather just using these pacts to gain more power. And that's important to note, as this explains why, for example, he never transformed his clan or later empire into an all-out Daedra cult, as he never really seemed to openly worship, but rather he just made pacts with Daedra in secret to gain power, and then kept them secret when he got certain power or allies, getting defensive about it when people would claim that he didn't do all that stuff himself. And that gives some insight into some of the insecurities that he has and that he would keep having during his reign. Because when Durcorach had united the Reach, he wanted even more. He wanted to become the greatest Reachman leader to ever exist, and his eyes started wandering south to Cyrodiil. Now, one of the very few things that I'm personally deigned to believe about his youth is that he was enamored in his youth with Imperial culture, or rather with Imperial strength, as he didn't really care much for the fine culture and literary traditions of empires past, but was rather enamored by their military prowess and their strong rule over massive amounts of land, more land than any Reachman had ever ruled. And thus he started planning a conquest of Cyrodiil, dreaming of founding his own imperial dynasty. He then amassed thousands of Reachman warriors in preparation for an invasion, and in secret used the connections of his Witchman allies to contact the so-called Order of the Waking Flame, who were worshippers of the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon, the Daedric prince of chaos and destruction. Now, this cult brought him into contact with the Daedric prince himself, and Durcorach then made the ultimate bargain with the Daedric prince of destruction in secret. Mehrunes Dagon promised Durcorach the loyalty of his cult and his followers in Cyrodiil, some of whom had very high positions in the Cyrodiilic nobility, which ensured that when Durcorach conquered the province he would actually have enough support to become emperor and establish a stable rule. Now, in exchange, Durcorach pledged his and his successor's services to the Daedric prince, who instructed him to create 4 Daedric weapons of immense power, which would be called the 4 Ambitions of Mehrunes Dagon. With these 4 ambitions, Mehrunes Dagon would be able to fuse his own realm with Nirn and promise Durcorach and his heirs the eternal rule over all the mortals when the realms would be merged. Durcorach agreed to the pact, as the opportunity to rule all mortals was of course very enticing, and he invaded Cyrodiil with his Reachman warriors, and as they overran the province, the cultists of Mehrunes Dagon and his followers in high places ensured that the Cyrodiilic nobility would accept Durcorach as a ruler once he had conquered the entire province of Cyrodiil. The pact with Mehrunes Dagon was kept secret to everyone, except for a select few who would be working to create the Daedric weapons, and as such, Durcorach's rule began. Now, his rule was characterized by contrasts, as on one hand Cyrodiil's new emperor was still a barbaric chieftain, easy to anger, no caring for fine culture, and according to some even illiterate, as he apparently couldn't read, but that could also have been slander by his political enemies. I mean, a barbarian who can't read is an easy caricature to make up, but we do know that he had no formal education of any sort, so make of that what you will. So on one hand he was barbaric, but then on the other hand he seemed to understand that the barbaric ways of rule of the Reach, based on clans and chieftains, wasn't suitable for a Tamrielic-wide empire, which was his dream. So partly to please the Cyrodiilic nobility and partly out of his own desire to create something to last, something stable, he took on many Cyrodiilic practices. He created a new Elder Council of Nobles to advise him, just as the Riemann emperors had done, and he also tried to take on many imperial protocols and truly make himself an imperial ruler while still embracing his Reach heritage, as he never tried to hide where he came from, but he did try to reconciliate the two cultures in himself to make his rule a success. A really telling account comes from the memoirs of one of his aides, who writes that all the aides of the emperor were scared of Durcorach's temper, but they also really respected and sympathized with him because he tried really hard to understand imperial court protocols, and he demanded that people would teach him how an emperor of Cyrodiil was supposed to carry himself, despite being constantly frustrated with the culture and not understanding a bit of it, but he really kept trying and pushing through, earning the respect of his imperial aides at the very least. He also married Varaxia Tharn around this time, a member of the powerful Cyrodiilic Tharn family, to embrace more of an imperial culture and show this to his new people about how he truly wanted to be a ruler for everyone and unite the two cultures rather than become a barbarian despot ruler. His official biography also shows this, as there he has himself described as the savior of Cyrodiil, and a savior of Cyrodiilic culture, a barbarian who came from the north respecting imperial culture, who wanted to save it from the chaos and the rule of corrupt elites that it had landed in after the fall of the Riemann Empire. It's also during this time that the name Longhouse Emperor seems to have surfaced first. Likely it was first a mocking nickname of sorts that the nobles in opposition called Emperor Durcorach, mocking him for his barbarian roots. But it seems that Durcorach actually embraced this nickname, and he would call himself the Longhouse Emperor, a nickname which mirrored the way that he wished to be seen, with the Longhouse as a symbol of his roots and the title of Emperor as a sign of his embrace of imperial culture. But for all his trying, according to his aide, he never fully managed to embrace the culture himself, as he would always remain a Reachman at heart, sticking to some Reachman rituals and never truly being at ease in imperial court culture, which also meant that to an extent he was always insecure over his own legitimacy as ruler, as he never felt at home at his own court, although it does seem that the Cyrodiilic people were generally happy with him. Or rather, they were happy with the stability that his rule brought to Cyrodiil after a little over a century of infighting. And they also saw promise in his son, Moricar, a boy born to a previous wife of Durcorach's, who had been born in the Reach but spent his teens getting educated under the best imperial tutors, including members of the Elder Council. Now, this meant that Prince Moricar, despite being heavily influenced by the culture of the Reach, knew how to carry himself and had a feeling for the imperial politics that his father never could have had. This promised a strong successor and thus a promising outlook for Durcorach's dynasty. And this proved true, as when Durcorach attempted an invasion of High Rock, a region that he presumed to be easy to conquer due to it being fractured in many different quarreling kingdoms, He failed terribly when the kingdoms of High Rock united into the first Daggerfall Covenant, consisting of the kingdoms of High Rock who united against the foreign aggressor. Now Emeric, who was then simply a noble general serving in High Rock's armies and not yet a king, is said to have slain Emperor Durcorach himself before the walls of Daggerfall, which was a crushing defeat for the Empire. But with Durcorach dead, it was Moricar, his son, who took the throne. Allegedly, Moricar ensured a swift transition of power with the help of the followers of Mehrunes Dagon in his cult, as Moricar pledged his life to the cause that his father had used to make himself an emperor. You see, the construction of the 4 ambitions, the weapons that Durcorach has promised Mehrunes Dagon in exchange for power, had begun, and Moricar vowed to finish what his father had started for Mehrunes Dagon. Now, Moricar also kept his pact with the Daedric Prince secret to the people, and to the outside he was a far more imperial ruler than his father had ever been. Many saw him as a strong and capable man with a good set of brains and his barbarian roots blunted by years of imperial education. He was a man who understood nuances and diplomacy, something which showed in the first weeks of his rule when rather than fighting till the bitter end in High Rock as a chieftain would, he made a pragmatic peace with the first Daggerfall Covenant, which led him to keeping parts of High Rock and establishing political connections with the other half of High Rock. This all despite his generals assuring him that he could win the entire war with some more effort, but he saw more benefit in a diplomatic solution. Now, like his father, he was proud of his Reach heritage and never really tried to hide it, trying to unify both cultures, taking the good from both and presenting him to the people as a Longhouse emperor, taking his father's nickname, keeping both Imperial and Reachman leaders on his staff of advisors as well. Now, during this time he also fathered his first son and apparent heir, Leovic, a child that he had educated in both the ways of the Reach and the ways of the Empire, hoping to keep their original heritage alive while also creating a capable ruler over the Imperial Empire. During this time, Emperor Moricar also worked extensively on bringing the ambition weapons of Mehrunes Dagon to life, but we will talk about those plans in detail near the end of the video, just so people who want to play the story of the Elder Scrolls Online Blackwood can watch this whole part without spoilers, except for those things which were already told to us through trailers and general outlines. Anyway, Moricar's rule was relatively stable, although he did have the challenge of having to deal with the Knaten flu, one of Tamriel's worst diseases and plagues, which absolutely decimated the continent's population for a bit. I made a video on the entire plague and everything around it, if you want more details about that part of history, and that video is in the description. However, it seems that the Empire under Moricar dealt relatively well with the Knaten flu. We don't know many details about how he dealt with the flu, but we do know that the Empire, as a result of his rule, was in relatively good shape compared to other provinces of Tamriel during the flu. Because we know that during his time, the Empire managed to conquer most of northern Elsewhere, making use of the weakened state of the Khajiit people who were hit especially hard by the Knaten flu, meaning that Moricar was able to use this weakness by overrunning northern Elsewhere and incorporating it into his empire. Emperor Moricar then attempted to execute that same trick again by attempting an invasion of western Skyrim, which was ruled by High King Svagrim, believing the kingdom to be weakened by the flu and conveniently surrounded by the Longhouse Emperor territories on both the west and the southern side. Now, Moricar likely assumed that it would be as easy as Elsewhere, but it wasn't as easy as he assumed it would be, as High King Svagrim had his troops flee from Moricar's troops and retreat back to the City of Solitude, where High King Svagrim had his combined forces fall upon Moricar's armies, which absolutely decimated the Emperor's troops and left the Emperor himself gravely wounded. His wounds were so severe that no healers could save him, leading to his death and immediate succession by his son Leovic, last of the Longhouse Emperors. Now, Leovic was at the beginning perceived as a very promising young prince, and when he ascended to the throne, perceived as a promising young ruler. He was born in Imperial culture and had never even been in the Reach, and for all terms and purposes he was an Imperial. He didn't deny his heritage and did embrace it, as he had been educated in the ways of the Reach and had Reachman figures on his advisor council. However, just like his father, he wasn't particularly barbarian in nature, and he was a skilled diplomat and politician in his own right, as he was very well educated, by some even considered to be a bit of an intellectual emperor. He made peace with Skyrim and steered his empire through the closing years of the Knaten flu, and he also married a Tharn family member, Clivia Tharn. However, as the years went on, the so-called intellectual emperor started to embrace his Reach heritage more and more, possibly out of criticism by some Reachman leaders who would call him weak, overeducated and spoiled. At court, this at first started very small, as Emperor Leovic introduced small changes, like the kitchens adding Reachman cuisine to its menu, but slowly his obsession with his heritage became larger, as he started traveling across the empire to promote the culture of the Reach in Imperial counties, which wasn't very appreciated by the people. Around this time he also intensified his work with the Order of the Waking Flame, the Mehrunes Dagon worshippers, who had made sure that Leovic had continued the pact of his father and grandfather with Mehrunes Dagon to develop the four ambitions. And unlike his father and grandfather, he apparently was swayed by Mehrunes Dagon worship, and he was somewhat of a real believer. This all culminated in Leovic eventually openly having shrines to Daedric princes in the White Gold Tower, and eventually against the council of his advisors, legalizing Daedra worship in the Empire. And that was the final straw for the people of Cyrodiil, as former allies led by one of Leovic's original supporters to the throne, the Colovian warlord Duke Farron Aquilarius, started rebelling against the Emperor. Within a year, the rebellion's forces had surrounded the Imperial city, and after a short siege, Emperor Leovic was deposed by Duke Farron Aquilarius, who then took the title of Emperor after slaying Leovic inside the Imperial throne room, and then throwing his body down the Imperial sewers. This freed the Empire of their Daedra-worshipping Emperor, and brought the Longhouse Empire to a close, and setting in motion the events leading up to the events of the Elder Scrolls Online, which you can see in my video recapping the major plot points and background lore of the main quest of the Elder Scrolls Online. It's a good video, so I recommend you watch it. It's also in the description of this video. However, the death of Emperor Leovic isn't the end of the story, as the legacy of the Longhouse Emperors would cause more trouble than anyone anticipated down the line. First of all, Emperor Leovic's body, which was thrown down in the Imperial city sewers, was actually zombified by Mannimarco's cultists, and you can then fight this body in the Elder Scrolls Online's Imperial city sewers. But second, and more impactful, we actually still had that pact with Mehrunes Dagon, which would cause a lot of trouble down the line. Now, here it is that I recommend you stop watching if you wish to play the Elder Scrolls Online's Blackwood and Deadlands DLC, which I recommend because the stories of those DLCs are pretty good. Now, I won't spoil the entire story of those DLCs, as I will probably make separate videos on those DLCs down the line, but major historical discoveries and major plot points will be talked about, so consider yourself warned. So, in order to be guaranteed the Ruby Throne and the enduring rule of his line, Emperor Durcorach made a deal with the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon. Durcorach would create weapons for Dagon on Tamriel, which would allow Dagon to merge his plane of oblivion with the mortal plane, so he would be able to rule both planes, while Durcorach and his heirs would be allowed to play at Emperor, ruling all mortals in a Dagon-ruled world. Now, what kind of weapons did Dagon commission? Well, no weapons, as it turns out, although that is what everybody is thinking before the questline starts. You see, Mehrunes Dagon provided Durcorach and Moricar 4 pieces of his so-called egonymic, which simplified are parts of his essence. The Longhouse Emperors were then to make it so that 4 mortal children would be born under very specific rituals. Each of these 4 mortals would be imbued with a part of the egonymic, so part of Mehrunes Dagon's power, in their mother's womb. Then, due to a couple of complex rituals at birth, those mortals' fusion with Dagon's power would be completed. These 4 mortals then had to be allowed to grow and had to be trained in special contained environments where their own mortal powers linked to the mortal plane would in essence be fused with Dagon's Daedric power within them, creating an interesting overlap of magical energy between Dagon's Daedric power and the mortal realm. Now, these individuals would need to be trained intensely in order to make sure their power grew as much as possible to make the amount of power from both sides as big as possible. Most of this work was done under Emperor Moricar, who led the Order of the Waking Flame experiment on these children in a vault under the Imperial Palace. On Mehrunes Dagon's instruction, he even fathered one of these ambitions himself, with a priestess of the Order of the Waking Flame. Their child, Princess Mayreed, would become one of the ambitions. Now, these children were trained separately from one another in that special vault under the Imperial Palace, which was located partly in Mehrunes Dagon's plane, because these children needed to be raised in a fusion between both planes of existence so that their powers could be attuned to both. The ultimate goal of this big experiment would be to sacrifice these mortal children to Mehrunes Dagon when their mortal powers were fully fused with their Daedric powers, so that Mehrunes Dagon could take back his original power, which now also contained partial mortal power, giving him the power to enter the mortal plane without restrictions, because he now too possessed mortal power. That was the plan, however they never succeeded into bringing it into fruition, as before Emperor Leovic could complete the task that his father and grandfather had passed on to him, the rebellion against his rule had started, which led to Leovic scrambling to hide the project from his enemies. So he hid away the 4 ambitions, these 4 children, in special vaults across Cyrodiil, locking them away with a small army of servants who he instructed to complete their training. And then Leovic was killed, and he had no apparent heirs. Varen took the throne and the ambitions were forgotten. But of course, Mehrunes Dagon and his cult would very much like to know where Leovic hid the ambitions, as he died before telling anyone from the cult. And thus, the plot of the Elder Scrolls Online's Gates of Oblivion storyline starts, in which you attempt to find the ambitions and foil Mehrunes Dagon's plans. But there's one final thing that I need to tell you, with some heavy spoilers for the questline, but this belongs in the video about the Longhouse Emperors. This final fact is that Emperor Moricar wasn't as trusting and opportunistic as his father, and thus in secret he modified the rituals in such a way that if Mehrunes Dagon would ever betray him or his heirs, the 4 ambitions would be able to be used against the Daedric Prince to banish him whence he came. Now, how this whole process of using them against Dagon works, we will one day talk about in a video covering the entire story of the Gates of Oblivion. But he was right to make this little contingency plan, as when Leovic died, so the line died and nobody was left to finish the project, and the ambitions were hidden from Mehrunes Dagon and his cult, Mehrunes Dagon decided to torture the souls of the 3 emperors in revenge, keeping them forever imprisoned in the Deadlands, torturing them and fusing them with a piece of infernal iron so that they would never be able to escape his torment and wrath over failing him and his plans. And that is the story of the Longhouse Emperors. I sincerely hope that you learned something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today, and if you did, consider subscribing and returning for the next Elder Scrolls lore video, or watch any of my previous videos, like the one recapping the backstory and lore of the Elder Scrolls Online main quest. That one's pretty good. Now all that remains for me to do is to thank my top Patreon supporters, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Polo Rasputin, Athena Iodis, Dragonborn of Nerevar, Volker of Argonia, King Chris, Bulge, Scribe of the Scrolls, Doji, Fenrir, Sword of Bushido, Rakai and Mr. Christmas. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen that this channel stays alive, and for that I'm very grateful. That said, I hope to see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video, and hopefully I feel a little better then. Bye bye.